I'll pray in a moment, but just to do a little setup here. Obviously, one of the big challenges of being in pastoral ministry is that the New Testament is full of this intimate language about brother and sister and community and beloved community and all the one another's of the New Testament, and on and on and on. So there's an assumption that in the people of God that there would be certain sorts of intimacies that are appropriate to Christian community. But what happens is those boundaries, or there are boundaries there, and they sometimes get fuzzy, or people aren't exactly sure exactly what they are. They can't necessarily define them for themselves or for others. And sometimes that creates just kind of benign or minor problems. Other times, especially when you have any sort of predatory behavior, predators are brilliant at erasing those lines and even using those lines for themselves for their predatory behavior. And so I just couldn't even count the numbers of times that I've sat with clergy who have said to me, gosh, Todd, I just can't believe so-and-so thinks I did so-and-so. But they're just not aware that they've violated psychological or social psychological boundaries that should be in place. So I am super grateful that Diane and Mike are here with us today. Diane, to help us think about the psychological and social psychological dynamics that are in a church, and for how clergy people can both be instruments of appropriate unity, but also know where that kind of thing stops and starts. And for Mike to help us think through the more sort of ecclesial and legal things that both can arise out of mistakes, but that also can be presentative. So Mike and Diane, we're so glad that you're here serving us. Not all of our clergy will be able to be on today because some are bivocational or have conflicts, but this will become a part of our required training for all of our current clergy and our clergy to come. So this will be a module in our training. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Diane, and she'll have about a half hour to speak to us, and then Mike, and then we'll have about a half hour of training. And by the way, sorry, I just keep calling Mike. This is Mike Sloan from Grace, which you probably know from all of our announcements, but that's Mike who I'm referring to. All right, let's pray. Father, you have called us into really holy spaces where people open their hearts and souls to us and to each other, creates all kinds of beauty and all kinds of vulnerabilities. And we ask that you would just make us wise in this regard today, that not only would we ourselves be wise, but we would be able to train our staffs and vestries and lay volunteers in this wisdom, that we might create truly safe spaces for people to be open without being harmed. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, Diane, you've got the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here and meet with you all. And I am keenly aware that I'm speaking to leaders and educators and pastors with significant influence over God's sheep. It's also true, I think, that you and I are living in unprecedented times in many arenas. And what we often refer to as Christendom is repeatedly in the headlines today for damaging the sheep within her own walls, failing to protect them from exploiting wolves, and disgracing the name of the good and great shepherd. I suspect that the majority of you came into this work with much concern for others, wanting to see God's people know him more deeply and to help them flourish. And it is a good work that you do. It is also a work that gives you a seat of power. Whether you feel powerful or not, you are. You have verbal power. People listen when you speak. You have emotional power, for you often stir their hurts and their fears when you speak. You have the power of position. When people refer to something as top down, they often see you as the top. Not only that, your position is believed to be ordained by God. So if you combine all of those things, a position of power accompanied by the mastery of words, spoken with feelings from an ordained position, and you can sway an audience or an organization, you have tremendous power, which you often do not feel. You have the power of knowledge. You are educated. Your words are believed. You carry authority. You also have spiritual power. Both you and your work bear God's name. As leaders over God's people, it is assumed and said that what you do is for God and comes from Him. I am a Christian psychologist, and I have worked with broken, vulnerable, and abused people for 50 years. The vast majority of them experienced the crushing of abuse in Christian homes, churches, schools, and organizations, places like those you lead. And for many of them, those with power and in leadership roles often met their stories with disbelief or silencing. Silence has tremendous power, especially in a place of need. Like Cain, others denied and refused to be their brother or sister's keeper, but crushed them instead. Others assumed that whatever was done was the fault of the vulnerable, though our Lord clearly states that what comes out of a person comes from the heart of that person, not the one standing in front of them. The rejection, accusations, and silence of the precious ones I have cared for has frankly at times bruised my faith significantly. I expect it will again. The struggles such stories caused within me have changed me, strengthened me, and deepened my roots in the crucified one. He who became vulnerable on our behalf has not been silent and always bent down for the little and the least. Always, even when it included tremendous disruption in the house of his Father and what was called God's work. One of the things I have learned over the years is that Christendom, that external global system we call the church, is often not the same as the actual body of our Lord. And when it is not, it breaks the heart of God. Jesus disrupted the temple, God's house, twice. And he went out from there and wept, saying, I would, but you would not. We are still causing him to weep in many places. All of you work within systems. Systems can accomplish things individuals could never accomplish alone. God created systems as well as individuals, like families and places of worship. Humans have created many more. Systems educate, they provide food for the hungry, they build and care for the disenfranchised. Systems of many kinds have and do bless human beings immeasurably. However, like individuals, systems can do great damage to people. The Nazi machine was a system. The Rwandan genocide was run by a system. Both of those movements sucked in churches and convinced those called Christians to damage, torment, and kill many who had been created in the image of God. And they called it good. In both cases, Christendom, with its influence and power and the covering of the name of God, committed and protected unspeakable evil. We do the same on a different scale when we cover up abuse for the sake of the church. A system is a combination of parts to form a complex, unitary whole. The parts are meant to work together to serve human beings. The systems you are involved in were created for the benefit and thriving of people God loves. The word system comes from the Greek, meaning together stand. And if you and I look at the news around the world, and sadly also within Christendom, we often see another word combined with the word system when we read about what we call systemic abuse. The Latin word for abuse means things like force, deceive, waste, using humans wrongly. So a system designed by God to serve humans is instead then destructive, exploitive, and crushing the humans it was meant to serve. The purpose has shifted dramatically from serving the people to serving the system itself. The stated purpose no longer governs the system. We have seen examples in the news, the Boy Scouts, RZIM, the Catholic Church, Mars Hill, and sadly many others. There will be more. We are all painfully aware of the media reports in recent years of sexual abuse within our faith communities. We have seen many religious systems attesting to a spiritual purpose while simultaneously working hard to cover up, deny abuse, and protect the offenders. Many have done so to, quote, protect God's work, which actually means preserving an institution rather than the humans in it. Churches, synagogues, schools, orphanages, faith-based institutions have in fact protected those organizations and the power and position and wealth and many other things that are involved. We have guarded our material treasures rather than the treasures of people. About self-injury and disastrous consequences. If you destroy the people, there is no future. Leaders have influence, and therefore they shape systems. The more desperate a system, like in pre-Nazi Germany, or let's say a faith community devastated by a previous pastor's sexual abuse, or hungry people, or weary, war-torn people, all those groups are starving, eager for a champion to ride in on a white horse and make it all better. It makes them very vulnerable. They are vulnerable to being controlled and manipulated. In essence, they rightly long for a Messiah. But they are blinded and follow the wrong one, not realizing until the reality behind the stated purpose is exposed. Jesus said, beware of false prophets, which is literally false truth tellers. Quite the combination of words if you stop to think about it. Both false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. They look like sheep. They look like they live and are from the sheep category, and they behave like the wolf category. Jesus is not warning us against someone who does not teach the doctrine exactly the way we prefer. He is warning us against the teacher, the spokesperson for God, who speaks orthodoxy, but whose life is false. One who talks like a sheep, but in fact is a wolf. The words may be accurate or orthodox. That's the sheep's clothing. The heart of that person is wolfish, looking to exploit the vulnerable by way of deception. They attempt to look like sheep, but inwardly, where you cannot see, they are an exploiter, a robber, grasping, and predatory. The purpose of the sheep's clothing is to hide their true nature. They attempt to look like sheep and behave like sheep in order to appear as something they are not. What they really are is hungry for sheep. True sheep do not eat each other. Wolves eat sheep. They are looking for isolated sheep, needy sheep. What a staggering contrast all of that is to our great shepherd, the Lord Jesus Christ. So what is the character God desires to see in human form? From the very beginning, our God has been building his kingdom with human beings who were created in his image and who are to reflect his likeness in this world. As a result of our choice of self-rule, we instead now live on a ruined planet, and which we got to by way of deceit, and we continue to create that same ruin in ourselves and others. Our Lord came in the flesh to rescue us from ourselves, and he has called us, you and me, to be like him in this place we call earth. Jesus says, "Feed my sheep," and you will feed them poison and poison yourself unless you feed from roots that go deep into him. He said, "If you love me, feed my sheep." Exploitation is completely out of the question here. There is no room for feeding on the sheep. It's not about building kingdoms. It's not about fame. It's not about honor. It's not about any externals. It is ever and always only about loving and bearing a likeness to Jesus. People often ask me, how can we recognize a wolf in our midst? Well, the answer to that actually is, do not be one. If you excuse yourself, ignore your impact on others, mistreat a vulnerable person, you are complicit in things that are not godly. And you do it because it furthers a kingdom goal. So deceiving yourself regarding your actions and words in your own homes or with those around you or under you, you will become blind to what is in front of you. Some years ago, I met with a group of elders who wanted to talk about domestic abuse. And they brought several cases to me, and we had a discussion, but they had the most difficulty with those cases where there were no visible bruises. We discussed a marriage of many years that they were dealing with and the brutal, constant, cruel verbal trashing by the husband of his wife and children. They lived in constant fear. They were shrunken people, tormented and squashed by this man. At one point, one of the elders said he found the case difficult and was clearly excusing the man for the vile verbal abuse of his family. He had several ways of reframing his actions. And so I pushed back a little bit on him, and his response to me was this: I do not see how what he was doing is any different from what I am doing. I scream at my kids every day. Now, his screaming was of a different sort and at a different place on the continuum, but it was still on the continuum of ongoing unlikeness to Jesus Christ with his sheep. His excuses and self-deception regarding his behavior led him to blindness and dismissal of what was, in fact, quite horrific. I said to him, gently, that excusing his own behavior was leading him to excuse what was truly awful. And the need, of course, for both men was true repentance and change. Both men were grieving God, and the best gift the elder could give to God himself, his family, the church, and this man was to lead the way and face himself in truth and let God mold him into a different man. You will not see wolves clearly until you tend to your own wolfish tendencies before God. You will excuse them. One way we fail to recognize wolves is to measure a person by their gifting and their results, but not by their character. This thinking seems to be awash in Christendom. A powerful speaker who teaches doctrine we agree with and gets results we enjoy and applaud and gets praise can actually be a wolf, an immoral bully, an egocentric person in power who is herding sheep. And we excuse these things either because we struggle with some of the same things ourselves, or we assume it is due to being tired or stressed, and they didn't really mean it, or because the results feed us in some way and make us feel important. A shepherd does not do these things. A true shepherd looks like Jesus Christ. Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, knowing the Father had given all things into his hand, speaking of power, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. And what did he do? You know the story. He got up, he laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. To gird yourself is to prepare for something difficult and challenging. It means to get things out of the way that would trip you up. Jesus, knowing he had all power, took a towel and did a servant's work. It is not glitzy work, my friends. It is little and lowly. He is washing feet that will become dirty again soon. He is also teaching his flock how to shepherd. There was a wolf in the room that day. And do note that that wolf was undistinguishable. Those who lived with Judas, walked with him, and served with him did not see who he really was. We are told he was a thief, which is rather surprising because he was given the money bag. Now, why would Jesus give the money bag to a thief? It was an invitation to the light. Come, look, see who you are, and then run to me. Judas did not. He chose to feed himself off others. And no one but Jesus saw and understood the danger he carried in him. If you are holding ministry in your hands, in your life, you too have a bag. It will expose you. Others may not see, but our Lord does. You may be undistinguishable to others, but not to him. He is the light. He is truth. It is wise not to fool ourselves. Though others may not see, our God sees. The work I have done these many decades has exposed me to myself, as I'm sure your work has done to you as well. God put me there to care for others, to call things by their right name, and to humble myself and seek his place. He does not call me to fix people. He does not call me to set them free. I started out thinking that that was what he wanted me to do. But in fact, I cannot do those things. He has called you and me to bring his likeness in us, to bring his fragrance into the room, while he works to show others truth and set them free. And amazingly, in that process, making both of us look more like him. He has taught me that what I do is not my work. It is his work. It is done for the sake of his body, not to feed me or prop me up in some way. It is work done in his name, which literally means bearing his character. It is done for his glory, not mine. The work you do, the work I do, is not his, nor is it done for him, unless it carries his likeness, unless it is infused with his fragrance in all the corners of our lives. I want to end with a poem that was written by a woman with a sexual abuse history from her Christian parents, both of them, and from many men in the church. She wrote this poem some time ago, and it's called Stepping on Her Gown. It was a day like any other. Children from Unit 923 playing on the beach, gathering their buckets and shovels, a tired mother taking little hands and heading back to home. The retired couple in 704 were sitting on their balcony sipping coffee and reading papers chronicling the world's joys and tragedies of the day before, while 519 welcomed its frail, recently widowed, silver-haired resident to a now lonely space into which the two had once called their nest. A family of 4 in 217, suitcases packed by the door, traveling to Grandma's after some much-needed rest. "Good night, Mommy, I love you," called a voice from 923. "Don't forget to take your pills," came from 704. And in 519, the man looked at the frame holding the photo of his bride of 60 years, sitting on the table beside the bed, and then shut his eyes. While down in 217, one last excited FaceTime with Grandma before drifting off to sleep, and then the building began to creak. The foundation crying out, having warned its inhabitants for years, though most grossly misinformed. Truth mainly held in glossed over some hidden, forgotten reports, left with those in higher up positions with influence and authority. Documented sightings and warnings of leaks of cracks and breaks within and without. Severe deterioration found in the columns, the beams, and the walls, endangering the lives, the health, and safety of all. Extensive and costly repairs delayed, overlooked, or ignored. Major disturbance and inconvenience avoided. Besides, the building was beautiful still. But safety and health come at great cost. Just ask the loved ones of those who are lost. It would be seconds the units collapsed, and those calling it home, believing it safe, having trusted the titles and powers that be, would take their last breath and meet their death. Then a few days later, just across town, across the state, the nation and the seas, the organ plays. Hymns are sung and choirs sing. Greeters at the door and every aisle smile. Plates are passed, but there are drips, breaks, and cracks, and questions are asked. Answers are slow, if given at all. Investigations hidden, incomplete, or refused. Change and repair are said to be coming soon. Nothing a new coat of paint can't fix or can't cover. The message is clear. Stop disrupting the work of the church if you love her. Pastors, deacons, and elders all meet and agree. Special committees and deep pockets toddle behind. The cracks, the dips, and the leaks aren't so bad. In fact, shining the light would hinder the good and must be ignored in order to love and protect. Not to mention, there are little kingdoms to tend and erect. Side by side, Christ and his bride. Do you hear him? He is calling for radical, uncomfortable change, to look beyond what's pretty and see that we are stepping on her gown. The church is coming down. His sheep are being crushed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Feels like we need words more than thank you. Feels like you don't say to a prophet, thank you. I don't know what you say to a prophet other than we hear you. We want to hear you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So we're going to pivot now to Mike Sloan at Grace. And Mike, you might want to say a word or two of introduction about your work at Grace, and then help us think about this from another angle. And for everybody who's wanting to ask questions, I can't monitor the chat space and be present to Mike and to Diane. So Eric is going to help me do that, and will help sort out some questions for us. So when Mike's done, we'll have a time to ask both Mike or Diane any questions that we have. So Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bishop Todd. Good to be with you all today. And I am the director of safeguarding at Grace. And some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with us to some degree, but others of you may not be. Grace is a kind of a long acronym for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. We're a Christian nonprofit ministry, and our very simple mission is to help churches and ministries recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. I have colleagues who do a lot of work in independent investigations. I head up our more proactive kind of training and policy work that, of course, has everything to do with training about boundaries, thinking about boundaries and safe behaviors, implementing policies related to safe behaviors. So just so you know a little bit about my background as well, I served as clergy for about 10 years, so very familiar with that office and the power that comes with that Diane mentioned, and the need to have a good understanding of appropriate boundaries defined in terms of that role, especially of power and trust that we hold in the lives of others, that can be used to do so much good, that can be used to do so much damage. But for the last 12 years, I've spent working on these issues with churches. I will say I'm not a lawyer, and Grace is not a law firm. So if you have specific legal questions in your state, that's always a good idea to seek that out. So I am going to mention a few legalities, but know that I'm not doing so in a capacity of giving legal advice. So we're going to focus on the church, and yes, touch on some legal questions as well. And like Diane, I still consider myself a Christian by God's grace, though I see a lot of things that is very difficult to see, and that do test my faith. When I meet Jesus in the Bible and in worship, I do not want to leave the Jesus I meet, because I know I need that Jesus. Jesus, though, as a mascot for power or money or culture wars, I do not need that Jesus. And that Jesus, when people use Jesus in that way, of course, that's discouraging. So there's so much to say on these types of issues. And so I'm going to dive in now, but just say, look, I'm going to raise a lot of questions and some key issues, knowing that you all are going to engage and ask good questions. So I'm going to lay out several things, but know, of course, there's a lot more to say. These are not simple issues. These are complex issues and require some careful thought and nuance. So with that said, what are boundaries? Boundaries, one way of thinking of it, kind of how I think of it, is boundaries are standards that promote treating people with respect and safety, creating an environment within which we build trust and create a culture, an environment in a church of safety and of respect. And it just helps us to name what behavior and conduct is appropriate versus what is inappropriate. And of course, all boundaries are contextual to some degree or another. They can be impacted by context and setting and all of those things. So again, it's not all or nothing. We have to be very thoughtful. So of course they matter, as you just heard from Dr. Langberg. The Bible and Jesus especially speaks to power all the time. We hold power in the church as leaders. And of course, as Christians, we believe that ethics and loving our neighbor is a fundamental calling. And so protecting vulnerable people is part of what it means, is a key part, an essential part of what it means to know God, the living and true God, and walk with God. So setting boundaries then, to take it a little further, setting boundaries absolutely matters and is fundamental to protecting other people and engaging in what, in my work, I would call prevention. This is fundamental. Understanding boundaries and how they can work is fundamental to prevention. And it's not about being paranoid or scared at church, but setting expectations and clarifying appropriate standards really matter, because we're, again, not calling people to be scared at church. We're calling them to be present and engaged, and especially for us who have power, to be properly vigilant and protective. And the key thing that I've seen over the years is that a lot of churches have policies and boundaries that are restricted to a particular context or role. Like we have boundaries with the children's ministry for the hour of kids worship or Sunday school. Good, excellent, I'm glad. That's not where most boundary crossing occurs though with kids. It happens in the hallways, in the restrooms, in the parking lot, in homes after and outside of structured ministry. The same with clergy, like harassment policies and other policies we might have for our employees in a church setting. Often those boundaries are narrowed to the role of employee, but in church we have members and attenders who are just showing up there. And do sometimes boundaries get crossed among the members? Absolutely they do. And by someone who is, yes, an employee, but sometimes someone who's not an employee. So we just have to have that fundamental account for the fundamental reality that we have to have. We want to work toward boundaries that will be applying to the whole community, not just an hour of student ministry or youth or kids ministry, not just for the employees, although again, that's critical. So of course, you know, don't take my words the other way and say, well, Mike says it doesn't matter about Sunday school. Of course it matters, but it's about framing it in terms of the whole community. That really matters. Because often unsafe people and certainly predatory people are going to be testing boundaries. And so clarifying boundaries is a fundamental foundational step to clarify what the standards are and what the expectations are for conduct. Those who are predatory are going to be trying to, that's what a lot of grooming behavior is, for example, when it's directed towards children, or let's say it's a clergy person addressing that toward an adult even. There are boundaries there that they're trying to test, to look for vulnerabilities, to look for opportunities, to look to see how they can take it further, to test the person's reaction, to see if anyone else reacts or responds, or if anyone else is concerned, so they can again try to take it further. Because like Diane mentioned, there's this mask, right? This wolf in sheep's clothing dynamic. And so this deception and manipulation that is being on purpose engaged with by the predatory person, they're trying to hide who they truly are and then test for an opportunity and a weakness and a vulnerability. So clarifying what those boundaries are is so important, because then that's the only path to accountability. Someone is testing and crossing a boundary that we've named and said, hey, this boundary matters, like with touch, that touch is welcomed by the other person. It should just be a fundamental boundary. I think it's a no-brainer for any church community, that all touch is welcomed by other people, whether it's a child or an adult. There's a basic respect for the other person's body and their space and their person in that way, as one example. And so prevention works in all sorts of ways, but clarifying the boundaries and then building trust within those boundaries really matter. And even with young children, teaching them little things like, hey, we teach children this, right? Keep your hands to yourself. If someone doesn't want to be touched, you don't touch them. We're socializing them into healthy behaviors. And as a leadership, issue, this is how we really set and work on a culture of respect. The key is leadership. There's a current board member of Grace who does academic work and studies things like war crimes and really horrific extreme things. Well, I was asking him one day, like, you know, tell me something about your research. And he said, well, what we've learned about war crimes and like horrific things, like when soldiers do horrific things like rape people, we've learned that the real key is leadership. When the commanding officer makes it clear this is completely over the line and unacceptable, and he will deal with anyone who does and crosses that line, he or she will. That really is one of the key factors that makes all the difference. Of course, there's more to it, right? But as an extreme example, as a stark example, naming these issues, setting clear boundaries, that really matters. And we have to be careful because boundary testing is a part of abuse at times, but not always. There are people who grow up in, you know, unhealthy families, or they don't have good boundaries growing up, and they need to learn good boundaries and healthy boundaries and be socialized into that. And that's important. And people who are not a danger to others and who are maturing will learn from that pushback and feedback and learn how to go forward in a healthier way. So that kind of culture where there is reinforcing of boundaries, where there is accountability and correction really matters. It is helpful, again, to work on boundaries that will be appropriate for, yes, your employees, yes, for volunteers who serve in ministries, yes, for clergy, but really we need boundaries that are broad and a few that are in place for the whole community. Now, as a former pastor, I know you can't have 40 rules for the whole church. That will never work. That's too many. You know, the pool might have 5 rules or 10, you know, and they put them up on the big board so everybody knows them and there's clarity. But so we have to figure out how we can work toward that. And again, it's a leadership issue. Now, I do want to say a word about the issue of clergy sexual abuse in particular. That is a category of abuse of power that is actually gaining traction in laws in our country. There are now, I think it's up to 14 or 15 states that even when there is not a physical assault or an obvious abuse of power with physical assault of someone, there's a recognition because of the power clergy hold spiritually, relationally, and positionally, and of course in other ways in the lives of congregants, that when a sexual boundary is crossed by that leader, that is an abuse of power, and it's a crime now in about 14 or 15 states in the US. And I'm in Virginia. It is not a crime in my state. And then beyond that, though, you need to know the laws in your state is one thing I would say to you, certainly. And other states have laws for like counseling settings where someone is a licensed counselor or a therapist and other roles like that. But the key for us in the church is that we define these issues in terms of those power dynamics and relationships that we hold. And so there's clear definitions of abuse in our policies, that when a pastor, whether or not it's illegal under the state law, crosses a sexual boundary, we understand that fundamentally as clergy sexual abuse. And whether it's a pastor and a congregant, a teacher and a student, a boss and their employee, a counselor or a therapist and their patient, you know, of course, we know any adult crossing a sexual boundary with a child, or in some cases, an older child, that is an abuse of power. Helping our people understand those categories is fundamental to our work. And then helping them understand then, because of this is why we have certain boundaries in place for interaction. The tactics for clergy abusers will, of course, vary to the setting. It's that wolf in sheep's clothing. So they're using spirituality often, they're using authority, they're using the intimacy and access they have in the lives of people. So things like access and intimacy and care and ministering to people are then weaponized. In training, I often, when we go through examples for, recognizing abusive tactics and grooming tactics, often I'll just pull it back and say, so what am I teaching you? Am I teaching you that if someone is nice to you and wants to bring you a meal after your family members in the hospital, are they probably an abuser? No, of course not. Most people do that because they genuinely care. But abusers might use those types of tactics, of course, with a different motive and intention. But again, the heart of it is a testing for vulnerabilities, looking for opportunities. For example, somewhere that is more isolated, or circumstances that lead to vulnerability, like someone who is grieving a lost child, grieving losing a parent, dealing with depression or anxiety, and they need support and counseling. Those are vulnerabilities that often those who are predatory are noticing and utilizing. So it's important for us to name these realities, to tell people to listen to their gut. And that's just so important. Many adults who are targeted with either harassment or abuse even initially just feel very confused and guilty. Like, what did I do to make this clergy person or this person with power over me do this? I must have sent the wrong signal. I must have done something. Of course, they haven't done anything. It's the person is doing it, and they're not fundamentally understanding that this is intentional, calculated behavior. So that's by design, that there's a confusion. So a fundamental thing we want to do is promote awareness and discussion of key boundaries within our community. So there will be some for the whole community that we enshrine in policy. I think that's a very important practice. Of course, there will always be personal boundaries that are more an individual needs something or asks for something that we need to promote an awareness of and a respect for as a part of our culture. So, of course, good boundaries will address things like I've mentioned: touch, giving people space. I am 6'8", and you cannot tell that on Zoom, but I have learned things about how my size can impact people and the physical power I have, and that impacts how close I stand to people. I want to make sure I give them plenty of space. When a survivor comes up to me in a break in a training and starts to tell me their story and trusts me with their story, I don't immediately go to physically hugging them. I let them take the lead on that. Usually they do not want a hug. They just want someone to listen and validate their story, and I can do that. So I'm aware of those things. Our language, of course, that we're promoting boundaries related to language, words of respect, not objectifying people. Words that, of course, words that threaten, the words that degrade are completely out of bounds and inappropriate. Sexualized jokes, conversation, propositions. Of course, sexuality is a part of the world that God's made. We have to talk about it, but within certain boundaries. We have to talk about how to do that well. Of course, conversations can be completely and absolutely a tactic that abusers use to raise sexual ideas in conversation to try to push it further. Of course, images and content sharing, things like that. The intimacy we have that Bishop Todd mentioned, a church family, we sometimes say, but healthy families have boundaries. Unhealthy families, like I think of Eli and Samuel, his sons at the beginning of Samuel, it says we're worthless men. There's this very blunt assessment because they served as priests of God in the tabernacle. You all remember that story. And it says they used the women who served. Knowing the culture, we presume these were very young women, and they were vulnerable women. And these men who hold the power and position as priests were sexually abusing them. Now, it doesn't say clergy sexual abuse in the text because those are more modern categories. But what it's describing there is absolutely clergy sexual abuse. It's an abuse of power. And it says they did not know the Lord, and it says they were worthless men because they're using their power to abuse. So this intimacy is never, we have to put boundaries in, of course, there will be intimacy on some level. Of course, there will be interactions like a family, caring family at times. And the Bible uses that language, right, of the family of God and brothers and sisters and things like that, of course. So it's a both and. You know, knowing that we as clergy, so specifically for clergy, that unless we have a license and we're counselors in that license sense, we're not going to often be providing ongoing counseling to someone that goes beyond kind of pastoral support. It's not that we can't give some form of pastoral counsel, but we have to be careful around those. Those are often avenues that predatory pastors use to isolate, to prey upon vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So to just bring it back to, again, our Christian faith, the fundamental, you know, commands to love God and then love our neighbor. Jesus said, we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's what boundaries are to me, is look, if you need a boundary to be respected and to feel safe, and you would want other people to respect you and show that form of respect and help you feel safe in that way. That's what it means to be loved, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So if we would want someone to do that for us, we need to be ready to do that for others. So it's, to me, fundamental. We have to have that conversation with our communities, and we have to promote boundary settings. It helps the vulnerable, especially who are more open to being wounded. It helps everyone by clarifying expectations. So policy boundaries, I can't just tell you, well, here are the 6 ones you need, because again, they're somewhat contextual. And it does no good for me to just say, here are the answers, because really effective boundaries are not just words on a paper, but it's what we live out together as a community. So you have to work through this together as a community. Where are we going to set the boundaries? Now, we do have to be careful when we set boundaries. I think of the story I read about, the guy is John Lasseter. He was the head of Pixar, and I think he's still at Disney. Some of you know that name. He apparently was just terrible to women and objectifying to women, and would cross boundaries that were completely should not have been crossed in the workplace. And their solution was, at the time at least, that I read an account of, is they said, well, we're just going to not have women in the meetings. That's the solution. Well, that's, to me, reinforcing problems all over the place. That's completely unjust to those women. That the man who is causing the problem is bearing no cost whatsoever and having no accountability. And the people bearing the cost to, in their view, fix the problem, that's just completely unjust. And we have to be careful in setting boundaries that we're not removing the focus from where it needs to be. Those who hold power being accountable for how they behave. Of course, people like to bring up what used to be called the Billy Graham rule, and now maybe is called more often the Mike Pence rule. I think it's good to bring that up and have some discussion around that. Are we putting that in place because we think false allegations are common? Well, if that's why we're doing it, that's reinforcing something that is actually harmful that we do not need to reinforce. Are we putting that kind of rule in place because we think women constantly approach powerful men, that women are temptresses, that that women are just this way and are sexualized in this way, and that's why we have the boundary. Again, it can be reinforcing, in my view, very negative things that do not need to be reinforced, but need to be talked through and addressed. Are we doing it because we think men have no self-control? Many predators want people to think that because it helps them, deflect accountability. That's just wrong. Every person can be accountable and should be accountable for how they are interacting with other people. So rules like that can often cause a lot of issues as well. So that's why we have to talk through them. So, that's just a few words. There's so much more that could be said on that. Like I said before, certainly glad to come back to that. Many times we run into this idea when we train in churches that, well, what about the situation where the person with less power initiates the boundary crossing with the clergy person, for example? First of all, the thing to say on that is there's never an excuse for that boundary to be crossed. And here's how I think about it and tell churches. When I was a pastor, I held all of this spiritual power, positional power, etc. If someone tried to cross that boundary, I have the power to stop it. I have the power. I can shut it down. I can stop it and make sure the appropriate boundaries are upheld. So there's never an excuse from a powerful person. That never serves as an excuse because they have the power to uphold that boundary. Second of all, what we see all the time is that most of the time when someone raises that, the person in the example they're thinking of is a powerful person who has lied about who started it. Almost always they're lying and they did initiate it. They just want people to think that the person did. And that serves their purposes. That immediately puts skepticism on victims, just like false allegations do. If false allegations are common, that immediately puts skepticism on a victim who comes forward or speaks up. It benefits perpetrators. Perpetrators like to promote those types of things. Now, I am sensitive to the need for care and nuance here. And sometimes people, I think, overreact and say, well, is everything abuse? No, of course not. Not everything is abuse. Of course not. Definitions matter. And that's why you have to put clear definitions of emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, assault, stalking, and others in your policies, harassment, things of that nature. And sometimes people say, well, how do I know where the boundary is? Well, the key is we have to talk through for our community what healthy boundaries are. We have to create an environment where we can talk about personal boundaries as well, so we can respect those. But most of the time, I usually just push back on people and say, look, if you're trying to tell me that you don't know how to treat people with safety and be a safe person, if you don't know how to respect people on a basic human level, you do not need to be in leadership. And I'll just be very blunt about that. So if your intention is to treat people with respect and to be a safe person, it's not hard. It's not hard to do. And, as much as we do need to distinguish boundary issues from abuse, although sometimes there is a connection, of course, I realize that there are unhealthy people in churches. And sometimes as leaders, we need to set boundaries with unhealthy people. We feel the need to set a boundary for our own protection. That certainly happens. At Grace, in our work, certainly sometimes people take aim at us and we have to set certain boundaries. That's just a part of life. So I'm not insensitive to that. But the attitude of, I don't know how, I'm a hugger and I just need to hug people regardless of whether they want me to hug them. Nope, you're not a safe person. You do not need to be in leadership because that's not that hard. There's so much to be said about response issues that I have not had time to go into. There are things that I've not talked about in terms of again, a framework for culture, but we've mentioned, I think, most of the key things. It's just clear to have a mechanism in your policy for when a boundary is crossed or when the policy is violated. What do people do with that information? That we encourage, hey, if you observe this or you experience this or you see this, here's the procedure. And we need a team approach, a team of men and women to make it as easy as possible for people to speak up about a safety issue, about a boundary issue. And then there's a team response, ideally, from the church, from again, men and women who are looking at the circumstances and the situation and reinforcing appropriate boundaries, whether they're the church policy boundaries or it's a personal boundary that was violated. That's critical, that there's a clear mechanism for that, an encouragement and empowerment from leaders for that. And that there, of course, needs to be some basic things, like there needs to be a bypass. You know, if the policy is you just talk to the rector, but the rector is the one doing it, that's not going to work, right? There has to be multiple ways of raising a concern. And that's why we encourage a team approach and an approach that incorporates men and women in those types of boundary crossing issues and accountability issues. All right. I know I'm 2 minutes over. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right, Mike. Thank you. So we do have a few questions in the queue here, and maybe a couple more will come in now. But I think maybe to transition, I'd like, Mike, maybe you and Diane to interact a little bit here as we transition. Diane, what do you hear important in what Mike's saying that you would like to underline from your point of view?
Well, I think the most basic thing is that he's encouraging the church to be knowledgeable and active in terms of dealing with things like boundary issues, which is the topic the church has not really had anything to do with for, you know. And so he's spotlighting something that is absolutely important and basic and either unknown or undone or something.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say?
Well, no, not on top of that.
Okay.
I think, you know, if that isn't done, nothing else will work.
Yeah. Yeah. And Mike, I know you and Diane have done some, at least I think I know that you guys have been together on more occasions than just this.
Yes.
What do you hear in Diane that informs maybe the softer side of what you're saying, or the human side, or I might want to say the spiritual formation side of what you're saying?
Right. And, you know, I consider Diana a mentor, and her framework has been so helpful to informative for Grace as a ministry. She was a board member from the founding of Grace. And what she said today, and what she said so many times is just so critical, because it goes to spiritual formation. This is not a side issue, a peripheral issue. This is a central issue of what it means to walk with God, to know Jesus and walk with Jesus, to be a disciple. If we have a framework that makes it obscure of how these issues matter, or that they're important, or that they apply, we have to revisit that. Because when you see how often Jesus talks about power, and you know, when I was a kid in Sunday school, I'm old enough, I grew up in church, I'm a pastor's kid myself, although don't judge me too harshly as I share that. I, from a little boy, remember, and when I was in Sunday school, I had a thing called a flannel graph. Some of you remember the flannel graph from Sunday school. And in that flannel graph, because the curriculum was built on the Gospels, there were wolves and sheep and shepherds all over that flannel graph all the time, because Jesus is using that metaphor in his culture to talk about power, to talk about how we treat one another, to talk about vulnerability and how we need to be protective, and what a true leader or pastor or shepherd is. That language we know that language is about those things because of the context of the Gospels, but he pulls it from the prophets, and that's the context of the prophets that he's pulling it from, right? Ezekiel 34, Jeremiah 23. Those passages are about leaders who are failing in leadership and are either ignoring the sheep because they're so self-important. Some of them are directly preying upon and feeding on the sheep, and some of them just love being in charge and being domineering. And Jesus addressed that with his disciples as leaders often and all the time. And Jesus addressed power so often. Those are just fundamental issues. So we have to make sure we're doing that work and having those conversations. It's absolutely fundamental. It's at the heart of what it means to know God and be a Christian.
Yeah. Okay, Diane, a question for you. Just assume for the sake of discussion that the vast majority of Christian leaders are not predatory, but nevertheless, these boundaries get crossed a lot inadvertently. What are some common mistakes that you see clergy making that are inadvertent, and how might that be avoided?
Well, one of them is touch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the shepherd, I'm safe, which could be absolutely true,
Mm-hmm.
could be safe. But they have not been taught or understood the fact that just because you are safe doesn't mean you feel safe to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think just, whether it's hugs or, whatever, what they don't know is sometimes they're terrifying people.
Yeah.
We're working very hard not to show it.
Right.
But it's just, and I think we tend, all humans, but certainly in situations like that, somebody says something about it, what we go to immediately is, well, that isn't what I meant.
Yeah.
But what we don't seem to know to do is to go to impact.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the impact isn't what we meant, well, it isn't what we meant, and that's it. So I think it's very important for us to have, as Micah said, as much discussion on these things, but also to realize that impact affects. Mike's a heck of a lot taller than I am, but when I was a little younger,
But you're not short.
no, I
You're
was
not short,
I
Diane.
was not until some recent years I was 6 feet tall. And I learned as a girl that my height affected people when I walked in a classroom. I was a classmate just like they were, but I was different, and
Yeah.
something was felt from that. And I needed to consider that. I couldn't help it. It's not like
Right.
I could change it.
Right.
And I didn't mean for that impact, but I needed to understand it
Yeah.
and respond accordingly.
So it sounds to me, Diane, like that what you're saying is we need to cultivate an intuition that's almost split second for what will be my impact with this word, with this potential touch, not something you go away and think about for 30 minutes, but an instinct, an intuition about our power and the potential impact, both good and bad, of our power. Am I right?
Yes, and one of the ways we can show that we're doing something that is by asking permission. I have in recent years begun to see pastors, just watch them with somebody, and they'll say, can I shake your hand? Can I give you a hug? They at least ask permission.
Yeah.
A lot of them still don't realize they have so much power that nobody's going to say no to them.
Yeah.
They have to understand that as well. But the fact is, not so many years ago, nobody ever asked the question.
Yeah. And as you say, I think, there's such things as, emotional, EQ and social IQ and that sort of thing, so that we're not trying to make something rigid and legalistic here. It'll sometimes seem obvious that you can reach out your hand and it's the right moment to shake hands. On the other hand, if we're going to pray for somebody, laying hands on people, that's probably an appropriate time to say, do you mind if I or we place our hand gently on your shoulder?
Yes.
Or if you're with somebody who appears to be vulnerable, to say, can I give you a hug? Or if they look like they would like a hug, to say, You look like maybe you could appreciate a hug or something. So I just want people to have the picture that we're not talking about stultifying every human interaction. We're just talking about trying to be aware of others because of the power we have, right?
Yes, and show care and respect for them. Just a very
Yeah.
quick story. I'm the daughter of
Mhm.
an Air Force colonel, so I learned many, many things in that place. But when I was probably 5 years old, we were having the general at the Pentagon come to dinner at our house. And my father wanted me to greet the general at the front door.
Mm,
He practiced it with me, I don't know how many times before the night the general came. And he would knock on the door and I would open the door and I would say, "Welcome to our house, General so and so." And then he said to me, "And then you put your hand out to shake his hand." And I said to him, "Why do I have to do it first?"
mm,
And he said, "Because no gentleman or general will shake a female's hand without permission."
mm.
So I grew up with that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's the right rule, but there's something in that rule that we don't have or we've lost. That
Yeah.
so this guy who was over 6 feet tall weighed probably 200 and some pounds. I'm
Mhm.
5 years old,
Yeah.
but my father knew that he would not shake my hand unless I put my hand out first.
Yeah. I guess what I would want to say is I would hope that we could all practice what you're suggesting to us out of an attitude of love and of
Yes,
service, not of, oh, I'm somehow now bound by woke culture.
no,
But that we're just trying to be loving, kind, like doing to others what we would want done to us if we felt vulnerable or socially awkward or didn't want to be touched for whatever reason.
yes,
Right? I mean, this is to me, these are just little acts of love.
yes, they are. And part of that loving is giving people a voice
Yeah.
that we want to hear and will respect.
Yeah. Mike, there's a question that I think may fit well for you. You touched on it, but maybe you could say a bit more about it. And that is the issue of accountability. You know, if you have a close
Sure.
church staff or a vestry or parish council or board or whatever, and
Yeah.
you know, they become relationally close, they're oftentimes friends and that sort of thing. And the pastor or some senior leader, some visible leader, a worship leader, youth leader, somebody who's got some visibility, you hear rumors about something, and man, you know how this goes, Mike. People freeze, they freak out. They don't know what to say or do. They're deathly afraid that if I say this guy's wife's my best friend, if I say something, I could ruin their marriage, or this guy's my boss. If I say something, I could lose my job. So say a bit more, Mike, about healthy structures of accountability. I mean, we have rules in C4SO about what to do if you hear something, and you all know where to find that on the website. But Mike, say just a bit more about the social psychology. How do you get around that and report on these things in functional ways?
Sure. Um, you know, I think just in good training and policy, there's an acknowledgement that often the initial response we have to something concerning is it is disorienting. Like, just talk about that. Like, of course it's hard. Of course it's usually people we know and care about. So of course you have to build in structures for accountability that are broad enough to account for the broad types of situations and circumstances you will encounter. In our view, in the work we've done with churches in the last, since 2004, it is important, I think, to have a clear distinction in response between if there is a boundary violation or a concern of some kind that's not rising to the level of an allegation or disclosure of abuse. That distinction really matters. Of course, sometimes it starts as a concern and a boundary issue, and then it gets to this other category. Of course, that can happen. But you want to make sure that there's empowerment for people that, look, we're not going to overreact if there's a boundary issue, but we're going to take it seriously. So, like, to the last question, And just to put a little more, like when I raised my size, like if men, you don't understand how someone can be afraid, you're not listening. You're not listening enough. You need to listen to people who are different than you. You need to listen to different voices. There's often fear, not because of the initial behavior, but because there's no understanding of, is this going to keep going and where's it going to go? So there's a book by Pamela Cooper White called The Cry of Tamar that I think is just an outstanding book on these issues. Would highly recommend it. But so back to the question though you asked, having that clear distinction of if there's a concern or a boundary issue or a policy violation, that's one category. And in church, you just have to have the broadest type of invitation to people. Here's what you do with that information. And again, churches are going to set this up in different ways. But you need multiple avenues and clear mechanisms as a start, and then empowerment to really help people understand, no, we're going to listen to you. We're going to take you seriously. We're going to believe you. And that at a fundamental level, boundary issues, policy violations need to be documented. And then a team approach is recommended to say, okay, what's going on here? What do we know? Well, I'll just tell a story. There was a youth group volunteer who was observed crossing a boundary at a Christmas party, and a mom observed it, but she didn't talk about it until the elder at the church mentioned they did a training. And once the elder mentioned that, she felt free to talk about it. And then the leaders went to the student ministry and said, have you seen this volunteer crossing other boundaries? And then the student leader started opening up. Yeah, he's crossed, like he's done these 6 or 7 things, and very specific things. So when you have a pattern of boundary crossing, that escalates the concern, because it makes it that, hey, this is not just someone who is immature, but someone who's maybe doing this more intentionally. Every boundary violation, like Diane said, you have to account for the impact and take it seriously. But in assessing how much further you have to escalate it in response is going to depend on the circumstances. And often it's a pattern of behaviors and disregarding boundaries that's going to escalate. Of course, the specifics behavior can in and of itself be something that's an escalating factor. But none of that's easy, and all of that depends on the circumstances. But you have to take it seriously while communicating to the people in your community, in your church, in the parish, saying, we're not going to overreact. If someone tells a joke they shouldn't tell, we're not going to excommunicate them and drive them out of the church or get them fired or something. We're going to respond proportionally and appropriately while taking it very seriously. Of course, abuse protocols are another category, and you really need some clarity there. And of course, that's where you have to have very clear protocols related to children, and then of course, vulnerable adults, and then adults who are not necessarily vulnerable, but who can be preyed upon as well. So I'll pause there. There's a lot more to be said, but those are a few, a little more of a picture.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Okay, Diane, a last question for you. It's intuitive for all of us to listen to Mike and hear the practicalities of what he's thinking. And I know for him, it's undergirded by an ethical worldview. And it's certainly easy and intuitive to listen to you, Diane, and no one could argue with what you said to us in your opening comments. But these things keep happening. I mean, I know I'm a bishop. I deal with this stuff every day. And even in spite of the training we've done, and et cetera, or even the fact of, Me Too being out there now for 2 or 3 years, these things just keep happening. So Diane, I want to end today with giving you a chance to comment on what are the formational things that leaders could do? What are the preventative, internal, as you said, Jesus's genius, that the issues of life come from the overflow of the heart. And your work in these decades, just give us 2 or 3 practices you think that clergy could practice off the spot, so that when they're on the spot of a potential boundary violation or something going wrong sexually or emotionally or with power, that they're the kind of person who could respond appropriately.
Okay, let me just first say that they keep happening because they keep happening. They're going to keep happening.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a welcome to the human race. This
Yeah.
is who we are.
Mm-hmm.
The church is looking at it in ways it never did. Again, I started out 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I had a young woman come to me about sexual abuse in the home, and I went to my supervisor, who told me not to believe her.
Mm.
That women made stuff like that up all the time, and I wasn't supposed to believe it.
Mm.
Said something about my personality, that I chose not to tell the supervisor anything and believe the woman. But and here we are 50 years later.
Yeah.
So it's not something that we have done, but so I think part of it is understanding hurting people in any way is what we're called not to do. We're called to love, and we're called to truth. And this is an arena where we have avoided those things. So, one, I think that anybody in leadership in the church, whether it's an ordained position or not, needs to read some things.
Mm.
They need to read about abuse and understand it, whether it's sexual abuse or domestic violence. Churches handle that abominably. And so I think some education needs to be done and required for those who have leadership, whether they're lay leaders or ordained. That's number one. And then number two, how are we going to, first of all, let the sheep know these are okay topics? The people who have been sexually abused or have domestic violence in their home, whatever, are still terrified to say it. And somebody finally comes forward, and all of a sudden you've got 6 women coming forward because that gives them courage.
Yeah.
So part of what we need to do is learn how to talk about these things in a way that invites people to speak the truth of their lives.
Mm.
You'll end up with victims who were abused as children and have never told anybody. It's not happening in the church. It already happened a long time ago, but they've never come and said so to anybody.
Yeah.
I think that we have to be educated. I also think that if you're going to open yourself up to this stuff, it's going to mess with your brain, and it's going to mess with your heart. And so, I came close to quitting this work years ago. Just, how much of this can you have a diet of, basically? But part of what I learned in those places is this is God's work.
Mm.
His work is not a building and a group and more people and all that. His work is people and their lives and their hearts and their characters and their wounds and all of those things. And to avoid dealing with these things is to avoid walking with him. He goes where the wounds are.
Yeah.
That's what he does. So I think it's a very important way to think about that. We're not just doing this because now people are talking about it, or because the law says we should, or anything else. We're doing it because
Right.
that's the way our Savior went.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also know, and I had to learn myself, that if you're going to do things like he did, you also need to go aside the way he did.
Yeah.
He went up on the mountain and looked at the stars. And one of the things I teach therapists is, if you're going to do this work, you need to find beauty and you need to pursue it.
Mm.
Whether it's in nature or music or whatever, multiple things.
Yeah.
You need to go there on purpose, because that's also who he is.
Yeah.
He's wounded, but he himself is beauty. And I think people get caught up in the suffering, which they need to pay attention to, and they forget to care for themselves in those ways. And you'll get weird if you do that. You'll start to hurt people, and you'll certainly hurt yourself.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike and Diane. I think I would just want to end by saying, when someone is hurt in the church, whether they're a leader or a child or elderly or whatever, there is a specific, concrete, real hurt there, full stop. And in some ways, we maybe shouldn't say anything else about it. But there's also a social reality and a social psychology alive in our country today, where, as Diane and Mike have both said, when I read news stories like I did last week, and that I'm not picking on Roman Catholics because this is true about lots of people, but you read the story of that Roman Catholic diocese in Baltimore. And so when Diane, or I'm about to say it, or when Mike says these things hurt our heart and they challenge our faith, and at least Diane and I are older than most of you on this call. You get to be our age and you can think, has my life been for nothing? Like, it would just feel like you're spitting peas into the wind of all these things that are afloat in our culture. So I just want to say that a part of what motivates me in this, on the holistic sense, on the bigger social sense, is to recover the plausibility structure for the goodness of God and the goodness of religion and the goodness of Christian spirituality and the goodness of his people and the goodness of being in a small group, where a small group does not have to be a scary place, but can be a place of healing, where the pastor's office is not a scary place, but a safe place in which to not just find a Christian leader, but to find Christ and to find healing and redemption for our souls. So I carry both those things around with me. And as I talk to Kimberly Filer, our ombudsman, that is the way we try to act. When we hear a report, it is first and most concretely about the human beings. But we're constantly aware that however we act in these things, we are shaping a culture in our diocese, and how the church handles this in the wider culture is also creating a culture that the world is looking at. So again, Diane, thank you. Mike, thank you. You guys have helped us immensely. We love you dearly from afar and are grateful for your lives.
Thank you for the privilege.
Thank you. You're welcome.
All right. Bye, everybody.